Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ocean Acidification Week 2021. We are going to get started in just one moment. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ocean Acidification Week. If you're just joining us, we're going to get started in just a moment. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ocean Acidification Week. My name is Michael Aquafreda, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, and I'll be moderating today's session. Excuse me, I'm just realizing that the slides that I'm presenting are at the very end of where they should be. Apologies for that. There we go. So if you're here for the OA Social Vulnerability Assessments Community Discussion, you are in the right place. This session is being recorded. OA Week is brought to you by 4 sponsoring organizations. The first is GOA-ON, the Global OA Observing Network. Second, NOAA, the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The third is the IAEA-OA-ICC, the International Atomic Energy Agency, Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center, and last but not least, the IOC UNESCO, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. For those of you who are new to GOA-ON, it is a collaborative international network designed to address 3 high-level goals. The first is to improve our understanding of global OA conditions. The second is to improve our understanding of ecosystem responses to OA. And the third is to acquire and exchange data and knowledge necessary to optimize modeling for OA and its impacts. GOA-ON was established in 2012 with just a handful of members. Since then, GOA-ON has grown immensely to over 900 members from 105 countries. You could join GOA-ON today by visiting goon.org. That's GOA-ON.org. GOA-ON also consists of 8 regional hubs, which we have heard from throughout Ocean Acidification Week. GOA-ON is an active organization that provides numerous resources to its members. GOA-ON informs policy at the international level, being involved with initiatives such as the Commonwealth Blue Charter, Communities of Ocean Action, and also the UN's Sustainable Development Goal number 14, Life Below Water. Specifically, GOA-ON helped develop the methodology for SDG Indicator 14.3.1, providing guidance on how to measure ocean acidity and report the collected information. GOA-ON has a data portal that allows its members to access and visualize OA data. And we welcome all scientists to submit their data to the portal. It's quick, it's easy, and it allows for greater visibility of your work. GOA-ON offers its members scientific mentorship, scholarship, and hands-on training too. This is through our peer-to-peer program. And if you're interested in becoming a mentor or mentee, please sign up on the application form. We actually specifically need more social scientists. So if you're a social scientist watching this, please join peer-to-peer. GOA-ON's newest resource is a webinar series, which was established following last year's Ocean Acidification Week. We have webinars monthly, and if you have any ideas about what topics you want to see, please send those ideas to the Secretariat at secretariat@goon.org. GOA-ON is also involved with the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, which is running from 2021 to 2030. The Ocean Decade will provide a common framework to ensure that the ocean science can fully support countries to achieve the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development. The OARS program will build on GOA-ON's existing work to further OA science by enhancing capacity efforts, increasing observations of ocean chemistry changes, identifying the impacts on marine ecosystems, and providing decision makers with the tools they need to mitigate and adapt to OA. GOA-ON also wants to draw attention to the 5th International Symposium on the Ocean in a High CO2 World, which is taking place in September 2022. Like so many meetings, it was postponed from its original date in September of 2020, but we are looking forward to it happening a year from now. Stick around to the end of this session to see a promotional video from the organizers, or visit the website highco2lima.org. And without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to our first session speaker, Miss Jessie Turner. Jessie, you could go ahead and turn your camera on. Oh, there you are.
Great, thanks so much, Mike, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me here today and for this great discussion on OA social vulnerability assessments, which is so crucial. So thrilled to have this be part of GOA-ON Week's program. So my name is Jessie Turner, and I'm the project manager for the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. And I'm just going to dive right in because I know we want to have a lot of great stuff to cover and want to get into the discussion period if we are able. So to begin this community conversation, I just wanted to provide a few framing thoughts from discussions we've been having with our government and non-government members on this specific topic. So go ahead and next slide, Mike. So I think it's important to begin with a few notes around the distinction between risk and vulnerability. And while this is very admittedly not my wheelhouse or area of expertise, I'm grateful and acknowledging Dr. Sarah Cooley at the Ocean Conservancy, who gave an excellent presentation on this topic to the Alliance earlier this year. And it's from her presentation that I'm sourcing some of the contribution today. So per the IPCC, traditional risk accounting measures the potential for adverse consequences to human and ecological systems, and it's an integrated measure that accounts for 3 variables of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And risk assessments rely on scenario-based approaches and usually include calculations involving the likelihood that an event may occur and the assumed consequence of that event in order to apply some sort of rating scale. And then while this is a simplistic definition, vulnerability encompasses the sensitivity to a harm or to an event, along with an assessment of capacity or a lack of capacity to cope and adapt. So those are sort of 2 buckets that we'll hear and sometimes are used interchangeably, but as you can see, vulnerability is part of a larger risk assessment. All right, Mike, go ahead, next slide. So at the Alliance, we've really encouraged members to start thinking about OA risk and vulnerability assessments as necessary tools to help them prioritize monitoring, key research priorities, and relevant intervention strategies that support our members' core goals. And that said, this is very new field of work, so there are not that many examples or templates yet to look to. But so far, we have seen 2 different approaches emerging. The first is commissioning a standalone OA vulnerability assessment, and the second is incorporating OA into a larger climate risk assessment. And while I'm not going to present the methodologies or findings of those specific reports shown here, I do want to highlight just a few tools, as I'm calling them, that have begun to scratch the surface of this topic in ways that I think really help frame up the purpose of why we're doing these vulnerability assessments. All right, next slide, Mike, we'll cruise. So here you have a synthesis chart that's curated from information within the Pacific Islands Ocean Acidification Vulnerability Assessment that was done in 2015. And as you can see, it lists regional assets, their importance to the region, as well as some assessment or assigning of potential vulnerability posed by ocean acidification. Next slide, Mike. I want to bring your attention to this really awesome publication that was released this year by the Government of New Zealand in their role as chair to the Commonwealth Blue Charter OA Working Group. This policy handbook is a wonderful asset that's full of tools and templates for thinking about risk and vulnerability assessments. And just you can see this document similarly starts to inventory regional assets, assigns some financial or cultural value to them, and outlines potential effects to OA. And next slide, just one more example. Here again from the OA or Alaska OA Network, who you'll hear from later on in today's discussion. It's an example of an excellent outreach and education document that was put together that lists economically valuable fish and shellfish in Alaska, and also begins to assess some potential species responses. And I just want to draw people's attention to these types of products and tools, because not only do they help engage stakeholders and decision makers and policy leads, I think they really help to contextualize and prioritize the most important knowledge gaps based around broad assumptions of risk and community vulnerability. And they start to sort of scratch the surface is where we're hoping to go in a more detailed and expansive way. Next slide, Mike. So quickly, what should we keep in mind as we move through today's discussion? Mainly, I think it's that vulnerability assessments can help inform decision-relevant, management-relevant information. This is because it accounts for these social, economic, cultural ecosystems and species components. It can help us prioritize, and of course, it can help inform community and local policies or strategies that are not just responsive to regional change, but also most important to the community. And again, just giving credit, this is largely pulled from a report by Mathis and Cooley in 2015 looking at vulnerability of Alaskan fisheries. Next slide, Mike. And I think we'll just cruise through this. I really want to leave you with some final thoughts from OA risk and vulnerability assessment webinar that we did in earlier this year. So Mike, the next couple slides, these are just some remarks from our presenters that I think will be useful in framing up the rest of today's dialogue. So again, these are panelists that participated in a webinar we had earlier this year. And sort of here's what they had to say. The first is that these assessments are often based on uncertainty and incomplete information, but that's not a reason not to do them. The second, and we'll dive into this a lot more, I think, in our next presentations, is that socio-ecological systems are sometimes data limited. So be willing to conduct qualitative or semi-quantitative assessments rather than giving up or waiting for more information. The results that we can put together now are still needed and can inform decision-making on some level. And then lastly, Mike. And so again, while we are waiting to fill some of these larger data gaps, we know that expert opinion and lived experience are important to consider in addition to this quantitative data. And indeed that these assessments are meant to be done iteratively and can be modified as new information becomes available, accounting both for that social as well as natural science evolution. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the rest of the speakers. Really grateful for all the practitioners who are embarking on this new frontier. While imperfect, these assessments are just so crucial for getting done all the next steps that we want to in this field and bringing more investments and more targeted response across multiple sectors. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessie. We really appreciate you joining us today and sharing that perspective. Before we get to Jan, I just want to quickly say that if anyone has any questions for Jessie, please type them into the questions box. If you have questions throughout this session, please type them in those question boxes and direct them to a specific speaker. All right, Jan, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Jan Newton from the University of Washington. I'm at sea right now, and I hope the cellular doesn't drop off. It's my pleasure to be here to talk to you about regional vulnerability assessment to ocean acidification. This was funded as part of NOAA's Ocean Acidification program. What's key about this study is what you see up at the top there. It's integrated, social, and ecological. I'm leading off. Melissa Poe and social scientists will follow me. It's place-based. It was at the Olympic coast as a sentinel. And then the other thing that you see there is a long list of co-PIs, and many of our co-PIs were from tribal nations, tribes who were co-PIs with us, and we focused on how ocean acidification is affecting people who have lived at the coast since time immemorial. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So the first is, how do we do it? And this is an approach that we came up with for this regional vulnerability assessment. The circles in blue are the social science steps. The circles in orange are the oceanographic and ecological steps. And then the circles in green are the ones where we work together. And so next slide. I'm going to talk to you about these oceanographic steps. And it's a pleasure to follow Jessie because those last 2 points that she made with her slides really hit the mark about some of the issues that we had and how we got around that. So without further ado, next slide. So issues, what were our issues? The first one, just click again, insufficient data. Oh dear, supposed to be a little Excel, just keep clicking and hopefully that Excel sheet's gonna pop up. There we go. All right, so that Excel sheet, you can't read it, but what it is a list of multiple species. The ones in yellow were the ones where there were data. So you can see we had a fraction of the species that were important to the tribal cultures that we actually had data for. So that was a limitation. Insufficient knowledge of thresholds. What we wanted to do is to, I forgot to read you the steps. So understand the variability in the chemistry and the biology, and then to look at the future as well as the current conditions with a model forecast, and then to assess the frequency and duration that harmful conditions exist, okay, when things cross thresholds. Well, if you don't, oops, can you go back? If you don't know the threshold for these species, that's a big limitation. Geospatial data lacking for some species, and also the fact that we needed to interpret this in the context of multiple stressors. Next slide, please. So how did we get around this? We braced and met the uncertainty. We picked 4 focal species that had different life history patterns. You see them there: razor clams, Dungeness crab, olive snails, and Pacific halibut. We were able to synthesize the oceanographic observations with the species location and put that in the context of the model output for both the present and the future. Samantha Sidlecki ran a forecast model that predicted conditions at the end of the century. Then we evaluated assumed thresholds, different values, 3 different values, one more extreme, one middle of the road, and one less extreme. And then we also looked at other metrics such as frequency of corrosive conditions, frequency of hypoxia for the multiple stressors. If you could click one more time, this yielded a compendium. And when I say compendium, we had over 300 plots of these. You see the attributes. There are different variables, different time spans, different averages, and then different metrics that we calculated. That could be overwhelming, but it allows to explore in the context of a given species, area, or season, or question. We want this as a living legacy that can be explored and updated later, but we didn't want to stop with that. We wanted to storyboard some of the major issues that we knew the tribes were interested in. So I'm going to explore one of those with you. So next slide. Razor clams settle on the Olympic coast in April and May. So already now we've constrained that to where is razor clam habitat, when are they settling, when are the larvae susceptible. Next slide. So what you're seeing here on the left is the future minus the present autumn omega aragonite. And the more intense the color, the stronger the difference is. And so you can see that omega aragonite is changing by upwards of 1, getting lower because it's a negative number. On the right, the panel is the percent of the month that's undersaturated. These are for May. You can look at the whole year in that compendium, but we're focusing on storyboarding the impact in May. And you can see in the red circle, those diamonds where the razor clams are actually found are showing high levels of the percent of the month where it's undersaturated. So that's an example of the kind of story that we're pulling out from this. And in the interest of time, I'm going to stop it there and hope that we get into some really good questions and turn it over to Melissa. Thank you.
Great,
Thanks,
thank you.
Jen. That was great. I'm just going to move the PowerPoints over to Melissa's, and here we go.
Thank you, Mike. Hello, thank you, Jan. I'm Melissa Poe, and I'm a social scientist at the University of Washington Sea Grant. I'm working with Jan Newton on the Olympic Coast Regional Vulnerability Assessment. I'm happy to walk through some of the process with you. Jan just brought us up to date with some of the work our transdisciplinary team has taken to assess biological risk to tribally important species. Next slide. When we consider the coupled vulnerability to ocean change in a social ecological system, the conceptual frameworks used for vulnerability require ever greater complexity. And I will pick up here to briefly discuss how our team added deeper focus on the social components of vulnerability in the Olympic Coast study. Next. So the key messages I want you to take home are, next, social vulnerability is a factor of socioeconomic conditions and processes, not simply exposure to biological change and hazards, but also, if you will, exposure to the social, political, and economic and demographic stressors, as well as access to resources and tools to adapt. Second, sensitivity is geographically and culturally specific, unique to place-based relationships and dependencies that people have with exposed environments. Third, social and ecological stressors are multiple, often with cascading impacts and challenges. And as a result of these three above, vulnerability is experienced disproportionately, where some face greater risks than others and have different abilities and motivations to cope and adapt. Next slide. The methodological tools in our social science team has used include ethnographic and qualitative interviews and traditional knowledge. We also convened participatory workshops using surveys and community dialogues to assess sensitivity to ocean change and identify priority adaptation actions. Finally, we evaluated existing social data to understand underlying social conditions. Next. Interview results from a community-based inform a community-based definition of health and well-being. For example, we identified these 8 components of how local people consider what it means to be healthy and well. Next slide. We then surveyed participants in a workshop to determine the expected impacts from ocean change to each dimension. Displayed here are results from 2 communities. And now you don't need to take in all the information, but what's important to note is that first, the status of some well-being dimensions is expected to decline more than others. Cultural practices and physical health are the dimensions most sensitive to ocean change, followed by community connections. And some dimensions, such as knowledge transfer and self-determination, may be more resilient. Second, impacts are not uniform across communities, which may reflect varied dependence on marine resources as well as existing community strengths. And this reinforces the value of place-based research. And third, note that understanding the sensitivity of different well-being dimensions to ocean change can help to focus priority responses, planning, and investments. Next slide, please. So to assess the underlying structural conditions and the spatial distribution of resources, services, and hazards, we drew from existing data from clearinghouses such as the census and public health to assess indicators of well-being that is based on best available social science and selected through input from over 100 regional decision makers and planners about the information that would be most important to them. My social science colleague, Melissa Watkinson-Shutton, assessed changes over time and across space from community to regional to state level aggregations. Next slide. And once again. So looking at both food security and education, we can see disparities in the conditions across social and spatial units, tribal areas versus county, state, and region. And this analysis reveals that vulnerability and adaptive capacity are uneven, where some communities, particularly those most dependent on the ocean, face greater risks than others. This is an environmental justice concern. Next slide, please. Deeper understanding of the complexity of the ties to the ocean and varied capacities among coastal communities enables us to better anticipate the human risks from biological changes and better tailor responses. For example, our collaborative work identified tribally prioritized resilience actions to prepare for ocean change. From dozens of viable solutions, 3 to mention are increasing community access to diverse traditional foods, revitalized cultural practices and trade networks, such as the Tribal Canoe Journey, and investing in culturally appropriate STEM education for tribal kids who are the future leaders. Next slide. I return now to highlight how transdisciplinary approaches that deeply engage social sciences in collaboration with ocean sciences and, importantly, local community partners can improve a more robust assessment of social vulnerability to ocean change. Next. Socioeconomic conditions and unique ocean relationships affect the responsibility and the sensitivity, rather, to environmental exposures. Next slide. In our Olympic Coast regional case study, we considered the subsistence and ceremonial food practices, community connections and knowledge transfer, cultural practices, heritage, identity, and sovereignty, and economic livelihoods among domains of socioeconomic conditions. Next. This robust social context results in varied risks and anticipated impacts to communities. Next. As a result of underlying structural conditions, as well as access to resources, tools, and social power, communities' ability to cope or adapt varies from place to place. In other words, vulnerability is experienced unevenly or disproportionately, where some communities face greater risks than others. Next slide. But they also have varied values, motivations, and strengths for resilience. And understanding this context gives important foundations for planning, investments, and actions going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Next, we are going to hear from Darcy Dugan.
Great. Hi, everybody. Excuse me. My name is Darcy Dugan, and I'm based in Anchorage, Alaska, and I'm joining today from the traditional lands of the Dena'ina people. And I'm going to be talking about working with communities in Alaska, including the fishing community, to understand ocean acidification and their potential vulnerability. And I should note that we're not part of a specific vulnerability study through the network, but I'm just going to be describing a few ways that the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network is developing partnerships that can hopefully be a foundation to support vulnerability studies in the future. Next slide. So quick background, the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network launched about 5 years ago, and it's a community of scientists and fishermen and shellfish growers and tribes and state and coastal managers and educators and other interested citizens with a common goal of trying to expand our understanding of ocean acidification, both the processes and the consequences, and also looking at adaptation and mitigation efforts. And so among the things we do are try to identify information needs, try to fill gaps in monitoring, share data, share best practices. Then a really important part is engaging with audiences around the state. Next slide. And I wanted to note here that we are part of a nationwide effort that's doing this. There are 6 coastal acidification networks, or affectionately known as the CANs. And we work closely with NOAA, and we also work closely together. And outreaches and engagement are a big part of all of these efforts. And to make sure our research is meaningful, we have to identify what is it that people want to know and how will they use this sometimes very complicated information that comes out of ocean acidification studies? Next slide, please. So the best first thing that we can do usually is to listen. And I've listed here some of the questions that we've been hearing in Alaska. Is it happening now and where? What species might be affected? Will this impact subsistence? How might this affect my long-term business plan? And then, like, when do we need to worry? And there's still, of course, a lot of uncertainty, and we're getting closer to the answers of some of these questions, probably thanks to a lot of people on this call. And how we communicate uncertainty about vulnerability is something that we have to think carefully about. Next slide, please. And of course, this comes back to the audience and how ocean acidification fits into their hierarchy of concerns. You can see on the left-hand side is a picture from St. Lawrence Island. It's a community that's very reliant upon subsistence, which is true of a lot of communities in Alaska. The middle one is about 50 miles away on shore, a community that's dealing with coastal erosion. And this is a big issue in Western Alaska. And is ocean acidification the biggest concern there? Probably not. Do we even approach that community right now? And then on the right is the crabbing industry that has concerns about direct effects on their primary species and have been reaching out to us for information. So next slide, please. Just in the short time for this talk, I just wanted to highlight 3 examples of the types of engagement that the Ocean Acidification Network is doing. And again, these are not vulnerability assessments, but relationships that could hopefully provide the basis for those. And this first one is for the United Fishermen of Alaska. And this is a large organization that's got a wide membership of both big and small industry players across Alaska. And they have excellent existing pathways of information. And so as researchers produce new results, we partner with them, and so it comes to them through a trusted source. We show up at annual meetings and make sure researchers are presenting the latest science. And we also formed a fishing community engagement working group so that we can do a better job of listening and asking about how we can better provide information both ways from them and to them. And we heard some really good ideas for ways to help them think about their risk. They asked for something that was concise and easy to read, and a hard copy that they could read on their boat that had a paragraph or 2 about what we know about each species. And that kind of gave birth to the State of the Science brochure. It's on the bottom middle there. We're currently working on the 3rd edition. They also let us know that they hope that, or they would like to better understand carbon policy. And we've been working on a 6-part carbon policy podcast series that's going to launch next week. We've also developed a relationship where we can draft up, we get the research results from the research community. We draft something up, whether it's a 1-pager or a brochure or an email, and we can send it to a test group of fishermen and ask them, does it make sense? Is it readable? And oftentimes what we hear back is no. Go back to the editing process. And Jessie had noted earlier the poster that's on the right that has the arrows of what we know about each species. We could not have produced that without the help of the fishing community. So we really value these relationships, and it's going to help us explore vulnerability together. Next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight the crabbers. The crabbers in Alaska are very well organized through the Alaska Bering Sea crabbers, and there's a lot of interest and concern about ocean acidification. And we recently added 2 crabbers to our executive committee. And I've started a regular dialogue between the crabbing industry and the ocean acidification research community, and held a symposium in May that was specifically focused on ocean acidification and warming for crabbers. And there's a big spectrum in the crabbing community, I'd say, between people who are very concerned and want to help by collecting data from their boats to those who are actually quite skeptical about climate change. So this is a really good opportunity to engage. And I should note too that the crab industry just closed for red king crab. They just made this announcement. This is about an $80 million industry. So quite a blow. And there's science talks going on this week at the Crab Plan team. And there's a group of ocean acidification researchers that are joining right now as listeners to better hear what's being discussed and what some of the hypotheses are. And the conversations right now with the OA community has been that this current blip cannot be contributed to OA, attributed, I mean, so we want to be respectful listeners, you know, and not beat a drum that maybe isn't their primary concern right now, but we can do a good job getting contextual information and continuing to explore what's going on with their industry. Next slide, please. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. So I also wanted to highlight community-based water sampling. There's a lot of communities in Alaska that are involved in water sampling for ocean acidification. And this is beneficial in so many ways. The interest has been generated from the communities themselves, and they're documenting conditions in areas that they care about that are most important to them for subsistence. So there's ownership in this issue, and it's also a great outreach opportunity in the community. There's about 20 communities right now. Most of the sampling is done by tribes and is facilitated through 3 tribal hubs. It's not a flawless system, and consistency can be hard, but we're working on ways to strengthen that network, and also working on ways to report the information back. So this is more opportunity for cross-pollination between community members and scientists, and to help understand risk. So working with these communities will help the data, will help us with the risk, and working together further on vulnerability. I wanted one more slide, I think. There's just a screenshot of a video. If you're interested in this community sampling, the Chugach Regional Resources Commission, which is one of the tribal hubs, put together a really beautiful 9-minute video on how this works, and it's on the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network website right now. And then I think this last one is my final slide. And I just wanted to highlight a risk assessment that was done for Alaska in 2015 by Jeremy Mathis and co-authors. And this is was a fairly high-level analysis that was broken up geographically by borough or census area. And to look at risk, they were looking at the dependence on marine resources that each region had that could be impacted by ocean acidification and community characteristics. And the areas that were most at risk, which are in red, were those that were highly reliant on fisheries harvests and had relatively lower income and alternatives for employment. And I think we're ready to update this. This was a great job at a first crack, but at this point, we now know a lot more about the oceanography around Alaska than we did 6 years ago through models and observations. This is exciting. And we also know more about species response. The species here were just grouped into 3 categories of shellfish, salmon, and other finfish. So we look forward to trying to produce a finer scale analysis that could hopefully produce community level results, which could be the basis for adaptation planning. So there's so many great examples around the country and the world, including those on this call. So there's so much to learn from out there right now. We really appreciate all the work that everybody here is doing. And I think that's my last slide. Maybe there's one more that has my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you, Darcy. That's really great. And if anyone has any questions for Darcy, you could please type those into the questions box. Actually, if you have questions for anyone, you could also type those questions into the questions box. And Darcy, maybe you can copy the link for that video that you mentioned, because I'm sure a lot of people on the call would love to watch that. All right, so I will now pull up Courtney's presentation. Courtney, take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the other panelists. My name is Courtney Cochran. I'm a program specialist with NOAA's Ocean Acidification program, and I'm just going to be kind of giving you an idea of looking forward some of the ways that our office is thinking about vulnerability going forward. And the first is a new vulnerability report that the Interagency Working Group on Ocean Acidification in the United States was tasked with writing. And Mike, you can go to the next slide. And this Interagency Working Group is a collection of over 13 US federal agencies who have different aspects of ocean acidification monitoring or research that they contribute to. And this report was mandated by legislation at the end of 2020, and we were called to write a national OA vulnerability assessment for Congress that is in progress and will be completed by the end of 2022. And also wanted to highlight that this report is being written in collaboration with really a wide group of people, including the coastal acidification networks, including the Alaska network that Darcy leads, regional IUS programs, sea grant programs, and within this, really a large group of researchers and stakeholders. So this is a way for us to highlight a lot of the work that people on this call are doing around the country. Next slide. So I won't spend too much time about this on this slide, but just to give you an idea of the framework that we're using, that we're covering both ecosystem vulnerability and social vulnerability. So on this first slide, thinking about the ecosystem vulnerability, how that captures both the level of ocean acidification within the region, as well as the specific biological response of species. Next slide. But I think what we're really excited to highlight in this report are the potential social impacts to communities from ocean acidification, similar to the framework that Melissa was discussing, thinking about what the factors are that increase sensitivity of communities to ocean acidification impacts, as well as the factors that increase their adaptive capacity or their potential for resilience. Next slide. So in covering these different topics, a main focus of the report will be characterizing the gaps in information, because this field in some ways is new and emerging, and it's very exciting to see different projects like Jan and Melissa's, or like the work of the Alaska OA network, but in large parts of the country there is incomplete information, or we haven't assessed the social impacts. So we'll be characterizing those gaps to inform where future work is needed, along with highlighting the work that has been done already. Next slide. So I did want to highlight that as a part of this report, we will be pointing to regional vulnerability assessments that have been funded by NOAA's OA program as examples of where we have more concrete information about what potential social impacts could be. The project that you heard about today on the Olympic coast was one of these regional vulnerability assessment projects, but there are others that have been funded all across the country, in Alaska, in the Northeast, and in the Chesapeake Bay, for example. The PIs from this project, sorry, if you can go back one slide, thank you. Just want to highlight that the PIs from this project are having a workshop next week, September 22nd through 24th. But the first day of that workshop is open to the general public, so that if you have interest in learning more about interdisciplinary projects to address vulnerability to OA, you are more than welcome to register to attend the first day of the workshop, and I will share that link in the chat momentarily. And then also want to briefly highlight that at the Ocean Sciences conference coming up in February 2022, we are hosting a hybrid session about vulnerability assessments to ocean acidification, and encourage any interested parties to submit an abstract to participate in that session. Okay, next slide. So now that we're wrapping up, we would like to open it up for questions to the audience, but as much as possible, want this to be a two-way discussion. So we've also the panelists together came up with a few questions that we have for participants or people listening online, because we know that many of you have also participated in the similar work or have backgrounds in social science, or maybe you're just interested in thinking about social impacts to OA. So as you feel comfortable, encourage people to be thinking about these questions as well and share your answers in the chat. But I'll also invite the rest of the panelists to turn their video cameras back on, and if we have any questions for the panelists in the chat, we'll be able to address those. Well, I have one question that I can get us started off with as others are coming in. But for those who have worked in chemistry or oceanography but haven't worked with social scientists, does anyone on the panel have advice for building interdisciplinary partnerships to address impacts or vulnerability from ocean acidification? Jan?
Sure, I have advice. Do it. Succinct. You know, I think one of the things that I've really appreciated about this regional vulnerability assessment that Melissa and I are leading, but with a very large extended team, is that it's not obvious how to do this work. Just even the chemistry, like and the biology, the ecology that I shared with you, it really underscored Jessie's points about uncertainty and complete information, and that don't give up, right? Don't be afraid to do qualitative things. But then to go a step farther and start integrating with the social science aspect has been something that has been incredibly rewarding. What I think is really exciting is that you are you're viewing your own world in a different way, and you're getting insights into another person's compendium of knowledge. And so it's asking me to turn off my webcam, so I'm gonna ignore and hopefully I don't drop out. And so I think the advice is to really think about how you can form a team of people who have the collective talent that it takes to get this kind of a complex regional vulnerability assessment done. So my advice, I'm just going to come back to it, you know, do it. I really encourage it because it's incredibly rewarding. Thank you.
Great. Another question from our director, Libby Jewett. Are we aware of vulnerability studies similar to the ones we've talked about in the US happening in other countries? Jessie might be able to chime in on this one.
Great. And can you repeat the question to me, Courtney? Are there examples in other countries? Is that the gist?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, I am not the expert on that, but given the work through the Alliance, can reference the members I'm aware of. In 2015, there was a OA regional vulnerability report that was commissioned by partners in the Pacific through something called the New Zealand Pacific Partnership on Ocean Acidification. And they brought together practitioners in the region as well as policy collaboratives like SPREP, like Pacific Community, like University of South Pacific, and others to commission a vulnerability report that then informed some of the various monitoring pilot sites that launched as part of the New Zealand Pacific Partnership on OA, and then also informed some of the resilience building strategies that continue to be built upon through other partnerships, like through PITOA, the GO-ON Hub network, and other partners like through the Ocean Foundation and GO-ON peer-to-peer groups. So that's one example. You know, and is it perfectly aligned? You know, that all of the recommendations from that report are now implemented through policy? No, but you know, it really did inform sort of those decisions around the pilot sites. The other example that, you know, outside of the US, although close to my home in Washington State, the province of British Columbia is quite interestingly, they put together in 2019 a preliminary climate risk assessment that had to do with the provincial risk associated with climate change. And I think probably to their surprise, ocean acidification ranked number 5 on that list of risks posed to the province. And so they are now going through a process to do an OA and hypoxia needs assessment that will inform the then sort of second part of that risk assessment is the adaptation resiliency building strategies. And so that will be baked in. And so that's really one great example. New Zealand would be another one where they have gone through a pretty extensive process through their New Zealand Community of OA practice, New Zealand Community of Practice to put together what will soon be an OA action plan for the national government, but has its origin in some vulnerability assessments through a group called CARAM, which we can talk more about later. But those are just off the top of my head. Surely there are more, but those are the quick ones that come to mind.
Thank you, Jessie. I think this next question may be a good one for Melissa. I'll read most of it. It's a little long, but Nadja Steiner wrote that I work on the climate change impacts project in the Canadian Arctic, which includes communication of potential impacts, including OA. We were informed early on that the social scientists should be involved, and later on it was highlighted that we need to be careful in communicating these climate change and OA impacts, as it can put significant additional mental stress to an already mentally stressed community environment. OA specifically is invisible and cannot be felt or seen, in contrast to sea ice retreat or warming. So how can we best address this issue in communicating OA? And I'll also add on, you know, Melissa, I've heard you mention the multi-stressors to communities and how those need to be considered as well when thinking about vulnerability. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for that question, Nadia. It's so important. I guess I wanted to begin by acknowledging that when we're doing communication or research relationships, that these are fundamentally relationships. And one of the ways to consider the potential impacts of how scientific information or other kinds of information might add stresses is to move from a place of listening and understanding so that we're keyed in, and to avoid what has come to be known as helicopter research. So really devote time to building these relationships founded on trust and understanding. What that's going to also do is push towards being more trauma informed. Like the more you know and have a foundation of understanding about the communities with which you're working, you understand the greater context of other kinds of concerns and priorities that they are navigating. And then also within a historical context. So be trauma informed, and that might require that you seek out additional training if you don't already have it. And then I would say that it's we're important to think about how we can do this work moving from an assets-based perspective, including focusing on resilience, not just vulnerability. And so in our case, for example, we've been identifying, well, what are the priorities and areas for resilience actions? Where are the areas where there are existing strengths that lead to community health and well-being? So it's not just a downer story, it's also around what are the existing assets that we can amplify, bolster, and move forward and advance? What are the priorities? And then that brings us to reciprocity. You know, rather than this kind of one directional relationship of like an information dump to a place that we assume is data limited. How about we think about what is the benefit that communities get from partnering from research? And some of that benefit might be working together to advance these resilience actions that may seem not related to ocean acidification, but indeed are related to community resilience, to environmental changes of a variety of natures. And so I gave examples of some of those resilience actions that we've learned about in our project, and every community context is going to have their own unique place that they're starting. You meet them where they're at, where their priorities, values, and existing work lies. So relationships, be trauma informed, assets focused, and bring reciprocity in your approach to partnering.
Thank you, Melissa. Those are great insights. This next question was directed to everyone, but Darcy might be able to give a first answer. The question was, could you share your thoughts about the response that research can give to local communities to the question, what can we do about it? Or how do we make it go away?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Something that our network has grappled with, of course, we all know that the root cause of ocean acidification is emissions. And we have thought, how we are not an advocacy organization, we're a science-based organization, but those are excellent lead-in questions to remind people back to the root cause and that everybody can contribute to emissions reduction. And I think it's helpful when giving presentations to end with the what you can do element and have a spectrum of what you can do is that both address policy and also some of the more common things we hear that you can do to reduce your own carbon footprint. So I think that's kind of an opening point sometimes for the research community to go back to the policy without going too far into the advocacy. And one way that we addressed that at the Ocean Acidification Network was through trying to think like, how can we go back to that root cause and help people get inspired to act, but without being advocates through this carbon policy podcast series that we'll launch next week. I think we also have to be honest with audiences that as far as making it go away, that there's enough momentum in the system that it's not going to go away during our lifetime. And so we also need to be thinking while we're mitigating that we also need to be on the adaptation front. Anyone else want to add?
Sure, I'll hop in there. I think my answer to this is going to cut across a little bit of what Melissa said. I think knowledge is power. I think knowledge is really empowering. I think what people are fearful about is when they know something bad's going to happen and you don't really know what it, you just know it's going to be bad, right? And so one of the things that we're exploring with our team is seeing where and when the worsening of the conditions are and where there might be resilience. And to another question that's in the chat, one of the things about ocean acidification is when you're studying ocean acidification, you're really studying the system. So you have to understand what's going on with the oxygen, with the temperature. And so from a oceanographic standpoint, that's one of the things I really appreciate about ocean acidification studies is that if you don't understand the biological community or those other facets I was saying, you're not going to understand ocean acidification or its effects. And so I think that you get a lot of bang for the buck from ocean acidification regional vulnerability assessments because you get information on these other factors as well, and working with the community so that they're asking the questions in terms of the changes that they're worried about. If they get knowledge back, I think that allows people to think about adaptation strategies, some of the types of things Melissa was describing. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And as we are coming to the top of the hour, I'm not sure if we have any more time for questions or if we need to wrap up, Mike. But I also want to indicate to people that if we don't finish addressing everyone's questions, that we can post these online at the OA Information Exchange, which hopefully everyone has heard about. I encourage you to make an account if you haven't yet, and we have that as a forum to continue this discussion as well.
Probably time for one more question, and then we will play the promotional video for the High CO2 meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. Jan had started to touch on this, but I'm interested to hear from the other panelists. There's a question about if there are other benefits to doing vulnerability work beyond building resilience to OA. So open it up if any of the other panelists would like to address that.
I would just echo that again, the resilience building strategies that are, to borrow the word co-beneficial, is important and useful. And from my vantage point, the vulnerability work or vulnerability assessments, they're just a very important communication tool to some extent, which, I think sometimes is undervalued, but I think is important to underscore how critical that is about the issue itself, what the main drivers are, as Darcy mentions, as well as what local contributions could be to limit stressors in different areas, and then to highlight, there's only so much, time, resources, and just spatial scale information we can get. So where do we need to hone in based upon these priority conversations, or community conversations, community priorities. So I think it really is just sort of giving some more guide rails to some extent to start to target some of this work at a regional and local level, which is, in my opinion, always good.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but this was a really great conversation with all the panelists. Thank you all for being here and contributing to the audience. Thank you for attending. And as has been mentioned, we will continue the conversation on the Ocean Acidification Exchange next week. All of the chat and questions will be preserved. And I believe the links for the RVA workshop next week has been dropped in the chat as well. So thank you all for attending the session of the Ocean Acidification Week. We still have one more full day of OA Week tomorrow, including 2 plenary sessions. So make sure you stick around for that, and we'll see you tomorrow.